What would you do if your own child, the one you sacrificed for, the one you stayed up with through fevers and failures and first heartbreaks, stood in a courtroom and tried to strip you of everything you spent your entire life building? Not a stranger, not an enemy, your child. That is exactly what happened to Alina Voss, 74 years old, 5'3", silver hair, a retired schoolteacher from Ashford, Connecticut, who once spent her lunch breaks tutoring struggling students for free. The kind of woman who brought homemade pie to new neighbors and remembered everyone's birthday without being reminded. Nobody in that courtroom saw her coming. And that right there was exactly the point. When Alina walked through those courthouse doors on a gray Tuesday morning in October 2023, she looked like she had shown up to the wrong building. She carried a single manila folder tucked under one arm and a worn black leather handbag that she had owned since 1987. No drama, no entourage, no visible anger. Her son Marcus, 47 years old, walked in behind his attorney like a man who had already won. Tailored gray suit, polished shoes. The confident, slightly bored energy of someone who considers a courtroom just another negotiating table. He had been fighting his mother in the legal system for nearly 3 years by that point. 3 years of motions, delays, accusations, and maneuvering. He had called her mentally diminished. He had challenged his late father's final wishes. He had told family members she could no longer be trusted to manage her own affairs. And now here they were, the final hearing. Marcus wanted the house, the 4-bedroom colonial on Birchwood Lane, where Alina had lived for 31 years. He wanted the savings account Harold had quietly built across 4 decades of disciplined work. He wanted the 2 paid-off vehicles sitting in the driveway. He wanted everything. His attorney had prepared a 40-page filing to justify it. Alina had a manila folder and a leather handbag. You already think you know how this ends, don't you? You don't. Because inside that handbag was a small brass key, and that key opened something Marcus had no idea existed, something his father had helped prepare, something that had been waiting, locked and silent, for exactly this moment. But before we get to what was inside that safe, and trust me, we are getting there, you need to understand how a woman like Alina Voss ends up in a courtroom facing her own son in the first place. Because this story didn't start in a courthouse. It started with a good man's deteriorating health, a son who saw opportunity in grief, and a quiet woman who watched it all unfold and said absolutely nothing. Not yet. Marcus Voss did not become greedy overnight. He practiced. That is the part that makes this story so painful, because Marcus was not born a villain. Alina did not raise a villain. She raised a boy who had everything given to him gradually, consistently, and lovingly, and somewhere along the way, that boy confused generosity for weakness. Let's go back to the beginning. Harold and Alina Voss were not wealthy people. Harold was a civil engineer for the state of Connecticut. Steady income, modest lifestyle, extraordinary discipline. Alina taught 5th grade at Ashford Elementary for 26 years. Together, they built something rare, not a fortune, but a foundation. A paid-off house. A growing savings portfolio. No debt. No waste. Every dollar accounted for. And they poured a significant portion of that stability directly into Marcus. When Marcus struggled with math in middle school, Alina hired a private tutor, money they did not have to spare. When Marcus wanted to attend the University of Connecticut instead of the local community college, Harold quietly took on weekend consulting work for 2 years to cover the difference in tuition. When Marcus graduated in 1999 with a business degree and announced he wanted to start a real estate brokerage, Harold co-signed his first business loan without hesitation. No conditions, no repayment timeline, just faith. And Marcus did succeed. By his late 30s, his Hartford brokerage was generating solid revenue. He drove a BMW. He owned a condo in Glastonbury. By any external measure, he had made it. But here is where the story turns. The more Marcus accumulated, the more he began to look at his parents' modest estate not with gratitude, but with impatience. Like a man waiting at a restaurant who keeps checking his watch, annoyed that the food hasn't arrived yet. He started making comments at family dinners, subtle at first. "Dad, have you thought about downsizing? That house is too big for 2 people." Then less subtle. "You know, if you transferred the property into my name now, you'd avoid a lot of estate tax complications later." Harold would change the subject. Alina would refill everyone's water glass and say nothing. She was listening. She was always listening. The first serious alarm came in the spring of 2019. Harold was 76 years old and had recently been diagnosed with a heart condition that required medication and regular monitoring. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to make the future feel suddenly closer. Marcus arrived at the house one Saturday morning unannounced. No Deanne, no grandchildren, just Marcus and a folder of documents he wanted Harold to sign. The documents would have added Marcus as a co-owner of the Birchwood Lane property. Harold read them carefully, which Marcus had not anticipated. Harold asked 3 precise questions. Marcus had smooth answers prepared for all 3. Harold signed nothing. After Marcus left, Harold sat at the kitchen table for a long time without speaking. Alina poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him. "He's going to be a problem," Harold said quietly. Alina wrapped both hands around her mug. "I know," she said. "Let me handle it." Harold looked at her. He knew that tone. In 39 years of marriage, that tone had never once led him astray. What happened next, between that quiet Saturday morning conversation and Harold's death less than 2 years later, is something Marcus never knew about. A series of careful, deliberate steps Alina began taking, one at a time, without fanfare, without telling a soul except the one person she trusted completely. But before we get into what Alina was quietly building during those months, you need to know what Marcus did the moment Harold was gone, because he did not wait long, not even close. Harold Voss passed away on a Tuesday morning in March 2021. He was 79 years old. Alina was with him. She held his hand until the very end. The funeral was on a Saturday. Family came from 3 states. Neighbors filled the church. Former colleagues of Harold's, people Alina had not seen in decades, showed up to pay their respects. It was the kind of farewell that tells you everything about the kind of man someone was. Marcus delivered the eulogy. He cried. Genuinely, it seemed. 6 weeks later, he filed a legal challenge to his father's will. 6 weeks. Alina had not yet finished writing her thank you notes to the people who had sent flowers. Harold's will was straightforward and professionally drafted. Everything to Alina, outright and without condition. Upon Alina's eventual passing, the remaining estate to be divided equally between Marcus and his younger sister Diane, who at 44 was a registered nurse living quietly in Burlington, Vermont with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. Diane had never asked her parents for anything beyond what was freely offered. She is important to this story, but not in the way you might expect. Marcus's legal argument was this. Harold had been mentally diminished when he signed the updated will in 2018, and therefore the document was invalid. It was a bold claim. It was also a claim built entirely on air. There was no medical record supporting cognitive decline, no psychiatrist's evaluation, no documented incident of confusion or incapacity. Harold's own physician, a Hartford internist named Dr. Raymond Cho, had written in Harold's 2018 medical notes that his patient was, and this is a direct characterization, alert, oriented, and fully engaged in his own care decisions. Marcus's attorney filed anyway, because sometimes the strategy is not to win the first motion. Sometimes the strategy is to exhaust the other side. Alina was not exhausted. Alina was ready. Her probate attorney, Robert Haynes, 58 years old, had handled the Voss family's legal affairs for over a decade. He was measured, thorough, and deeply familiar with Alina's situation. When Marcus filed his first challenge, Robert called Alina immediately, bracing for panic. Alina asked him 2 questions. First, was the 2018 will properly witnessed and notarized? Robert confirmed it was, without question. Second, had Robert received the envelope she had sent him the previous November? Robert paused. Yes, he said slowly. He had received it. He had it locked in his office safe. Good, Alina said. Then we are fine. Robert was not entirely convinced, but he had learned, across years of working with a leaner Voss, not to argue with that particular tone of voice. Over the next 18 months, Marcus escalated in ways that revealed far more about his character than his attorneys likely advised. He began telling extended family members that Alina was becoming forgetful, that she had left the stove on twice, that she seemed confused during phone calls. He was constructing a narrative of incapacity, brick by brick, through whisper and insinuation. He then did something that crossed a significant line. He sent a formal written request to Alina's primary care physician, Dr. Patricia Osei, asking her to conduct and document a full cognitive evaluation of her patient. He framed it as a concerned son acting in his mother's best interest. Dr. Osei, 52 years old and unimpressed, responded with a one-page letter that was later submitted as a court exhibit. It confirmed that Alina Voss was cognitively sharp, fully legally competent, and demonstrated no indicators of diminished capacity. Dr. Osei also noted, in the final paragraph, that the request itself had been reviewed with Alina, who had authorized the written response. Alina had known about the letter before Marcus received it. She had been one step ahead the entire time, but Marcus, blinded by certainty, could not see it. Then came the discovery phase, the part of litigation where both sides are legally required to exchange financial records. Marcus's legal team requested everything: bank statements, tax returns, property records, investment accounts, all of it. Alina complied completely. She submitted 11 years of financial records, organized by year, labeled by category, filed in color-coded folders that her attorney described in court as the most meticulous personal financial documentation he had encountered in 30 years of probate law. And buried inside those pristine records, waiting patiently like a coiled spring, was something Marcus had apparently forgotten about entirely. Between 2016 and 2020, Harold had given Marcus a total of $94,000, not gifts, loans, each one documented with a handwritten note describing the amount, the date, the stated purpose, and Marcus's signed acknowledgement of the debt. Harold had kept every single one, 11 separate transactions over 4 years, a new roof for Marcus's condo, a cash injection when his brokerage had a slow quarter, a personal loan when Marcus's first marriage ended and legal fees mounted. $94,000, not 1 cent repaid. The moment Marcus's attorney saw those documents across the discovery table, he requested an immediate recess. Marcus sat very still in his chair. For the first time in 3 years of legal maneuvering, he looked like a man who had just realized he was not playing the game he thought he was playing. But here is the thing about people like Marcus. Even when the ground shifts beneath them, pride keeps them standing in place. He did not settle. He did not withdraw. He walked into that final courtroom hearing in October 2023 and delivered his demands with the same polished confidence he had carried in from the beginning. The house, the savings, the vehicles, everything. Alina's attorney stood to respond. Alina put her hand on his arm and stood up herself. She looked across the room at her son, and in a voice that was calm and clear and almost gentle, she said 2 words that nobody in that courtroom was prepared for. Take it all. Robert Haynes later said it was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard a client say in 30 years of practice. And then Alina reached into her black leather handbag, and her hand closed around a small brass key. What that key opened, and what was inside, is something Marcus will spend the rest of his life wishing he had never forced her to reveal. Some people plan for the future. Alina Voss had been planning for this exact moment. Not a moment like this exact moment. The courtroom, the judge, her son across the room in his tailored suit. She had seen it coming with the calm, clear vision of a woman who had spent 50 years paying attention while everyone assumed she was simply being quiet. Judge Carol Whitman, 61 years old, 22 years on the bench, had seen a great many things in a Hartford probate courtroom. She had presided over bitter divorces, contested fortunes, and family disputes that would make your stomach turn. She was not a woman easily rattled. She leaned forward when Alina stood up. Because something in the room had shifted. You know that feeling when the temperature changes before a storm. Every person in that courtroom felt it simultaneously. Marcus's attorney stopped writing. The court reporter's fingers paused above her keyboard. Robert Haynes gripped the edge of the table. Alina asked Judge Whitman for permission to present a court exhibit that had been pre-logged with the clerk's office 3 weeks prior. Judge Whitman confirmed the exhibit was on record. She granted permission. A court officer brought forward a compact fireproof document, safe, gunmetal gray, approximately the size of a shoebox. It had been held in a secured storage facility and transported to the courthouse that morning under chain of custody documentation. None of this was improvised. All of it had been arranged in advance, quietly and precisely, by Alina and Robert working together over the previous 6 months. Marcus stared at the safe. He had never seen it before in his life. Alina inserted the brass key. The lock turned with a soft, clean click. And then she began to remove its contents, one item at a time. The first document landed on the evidence table like a stone dropped into still water. It was a will, not Harold's 2018 will that Marcus had been fighting for 3 years. A second will, a notarized, witnessed, fully executed amendment signed by Harold Voss in January 2021, exactly 10 weeks before his death. 2 independent witnesses had signed it. A licensed notary had sealed it. Robert Haynes had filed the original with the probate court 6 months ago, and a certified copy had been sitting in that safe ever since. The amendment contained one addition to the original document, a single clause written in plain language at Harold's specific request. In the event that any named beneficiary initiates legal proceedings to contest this will, or undertakes any action deemed by the court to constitute a bad faith challenge to the distribution of this estate, that beneficiary's share shall be reduced to 0 and redistributed equally among the remaining beneficiaries. Marcus's attorney read it twice, then a third time. Marcus read it once. His face did not change expression, but his right hand, resting on the table, closed slowly into a fist. Judge Whitman examined the document carefully. She asked Robert 3 technical questions about the witnessing and notarization process. Robert answered each one without hesitation, because he had prepared for each one without hesitation. But Alina was not finished. The second item came out of the safe slowly, almost ceremonially. It was a sealed envelope, ivory-colored, slightly worn at the edges. Written on the front in Harold's unmistakable block-letter handwriting were the words, "To the presiding judge, to be opened only in the event of a contest." The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. Judge Whitman broke the seal herself. Inside was a handwritten letter, 4 pages, dated February 14, 2021. Valentine's Day, 25 days before Harold died. Harold had written it at the kitchen table, Alina later confirmed, on a Sunday afternoon while she made soup in the other room. He had not told her what he was writing. He had simply asked her to add it to the safe when he was done. She had done so without reading it. What the letter contained was methodical and devastating. Harold described, in precise chronological detail, every conversation in which Marcus had applied pressure regarding the estate. He named dates. He recalled specific language Marcus had used. He documented the unannounced Saturday visit in 2019, the documents Marcus had brought, the questions Harold had asked, the answers Marcus had given. He described the pattern of behavior he had observed in his son over the preceding 5 years, with the careful, sorrowful clarity of a man who loved his child, and had no illusions about who that child had become. In the letter's final paragraph, Harold wrote that he was of completely sound mind, that he had never been manipulated or pressured by Alina in any decision regarding the estate, and that his sole concern in drafting the amendment was to protect his wife from a foreseeable and specific threat. He had foreseen it. He had named it. He had sealed it and left it for exactly this room, exactly this judge, exactly this moment. Judge Whitman set the letter down. She removed her reading glasses. She looked at Marcus for a long moment without speaking. Marcus looked at the table. and Alina reached into the safe one final time. The third item was a certified bank document, a formal debt instrument filed with the probate court 6 months earlier, converting Harold's 11 informal loan agreements with Marcus into a legally enforceable estate debt of $94,000, plus 4% annual interest calculated from the date of Harold's passing. By the time that document hit the table, Marcus owed the estate over $109,000. His attorney leaned over and spoke quietly into his ear. Marcus did not respond. He was looking at his mother, and Alina was looking back at him with an expression that was not anger and was not triumph and was not sadness exactly. It was recognition, the look of a woman who had known, for a very long time, exactly who was sitting across from her. Judge Whitman did not deliberate for long. The 2021 amendment was valid and enforceable. The bad faith contest clause applied directly and unambiguously to Marcus's 3-year legal campaign. His inheritance share was reduced to 0. The debt instrument was confirmed as a legitimate estate claim. Marcus was ordered to begin repayment within 90 days. He walked out of the courtroom without speaking to anyone, not his attorney, not the family members seated in the gallery, not his mother. Alina gathered her folder, closed the safe, snapped her handbag shut, thanked Judge Whitman politely for her time. Outside the courthouse, a local journalist who had been following the case asked Alina one question. "Did you always know you would win?" Alina paused. Her hand moved briefly to the brooch on her lapel, the one that had belonged to Harold. She looked at it for just a moment. Then she looked back at the journalist. "Harold knew," she said quietly. "He just needed me to hold the key." She walked to her car. Robert held the door open. Neither of them said anything for a long time. But there is one final piece of this story that almost no one knows about. Something Alina did the very next morning, before she made coffee, before she called Diane, before she did anything else at all. And when you hear it, everything you think you know about Alina Voss will rearrange itself into something even more remarkable. The morning after the verdict, Alina Voss woke up at 5:53. She did not sleep in. She did not celebrate. She made no phone calls, sent no messages, and did not sit in quiet satisfaction replaying the previous day's events in her mind. She went to her desk. Specifically, the small oak writing desk in the corner of the upstairs bedroom that had been Harold's desk before it became hers. The one with the worn leather blotter and the brass lamp he had owned since graduate school. She sat down, opened the center drawer, and removed 2 envelopes she had prepared the week before the hearing. She had written them in advance, because Alina Voss did not leave things to chance. The first envelope was addressed to Robert Haynes. Inside was a handwritten letter thanking him for 3 years of steady, principled legal counsel, and a personal check covering his full outstanding fees, plus a 20% addition she had calculated herself and decided upon without being asked. Robert later said, in a conversation with a colleague, that it was the only time in 30 years of practice that a client had voluntarily overpaid him, and explained precisely why in writing. The second envelope was addressed to an organization called Compass Legal Services, a nonprofit based in Hartford that provides free and subsidized legal representation to elderly residents facing financial exploitation and estate disputes. Alina had discovered them 18 months earlier while researching her own case, and had quietly attended one of their community information sessions under a name no one recognized. Inside that envelope was a personal check for $47,000. Not Harold's money, hers, money she had saved independently over 20 years of careful, deliberate financial discipline. A separate account Marcus had never known existed because it had never been in Harold's name or their joint records. A private account Alina had opened in 1998 under the advice of a female financial advisor who had told her, in those exact words, that every woman deserves a number that belongs only to her. Alina had kept that advice for 25 years. Along with the check, she included a 1-page letter to the organization's director explaining her reason for the donation. She wrote that during her own legal ordeal, She had learned that dozens of elderly women in Connecticut had faced near-identical situations and lost, not because their cases were weaker, not because their claims were less valid, but because they had run out of money before they ran out of fight. She wanted those women to have what Harold had given her: time, preparation, and someone steady in their corner. She signed the letter with her full name: Eleanor Margaret Voss, retired teacher, Ashford, Connecticut. Then she called Diane. Diane had watched the final hearing via video call from her kitchen in Burlington, her two daughters home from school specifically to sit with her. When Eleanor's voice came through the phone that morning, Diane did not speak for almost 30 seconds. She just breathed, the way people breathe when something they have been holding for 3 years finally releases. Eleanor told her that the Birchwood Lane house was being placed into a living trust with Diane as the sole beneficiary upon Eleanor's passing. She told her this was not negotiable and had already been filed. Diane started to object, something about it not being fair, about Eleanor needing to think of herself. Eleanor interrupted her gently. "I am thinking of myself," Eleanor said. "I want to know it goes to someone who deserves it. That is entirely selfish, and I am completely comfortable with it." Diane laughed. It was the first real laugh in a very long time. Now step back from the details for just a moment. Because this story is easy to watch as a courtroom drama, a tale of a greedy son defeated by a clever mother, a satisfying legal thriller with a clean resolution. And it is all of those things. But it is also something else entirely. Eleanor Voss spent 74 years living in a world that consistently and quietly underestimated her. As a young teacher in the 1970s, who was paid measurably less than her male colleagues for identical work. As a wife whose suggestions about financial planning were occasionally received as charming rather than serious. As a grieving widow whom her own son calculated could be outmaneuvered within 6 weeks of her husband's funeral. Every single one of those people made the same mistake. They looked at Eleanor and saw softness. They saw the pie she brought to neighbors and the birthday cards she remembered to send and the gentle way she refilled everyone's water glass at dinner. They saw a woman who made things comfortable. They missed the woman underneath, who was paying attention to every single thing. Eleanor did not win that courtroom because she was lucky. She did not win because Harold had been secretly brilliant in ways no one anticipated. She won because for 3 years, while Marcus spent nearly $40,000 in legal fees trying to take apart a life she had built, Eleanor was doing what she had always done. She was working, quietly, precisely, without wasting a single move. Documentation is dignity. That is the real lesson sitting at the center of this story. Not the safe, not the clause, not the letter Harold wrote on Valentine's Day with soup simmering in the next room. All of those things were possible because two people had spent decades treating their own lives as worth recording carefully. Every loan noted, every conversation remembered, every decision witnessed and sealed and stored with the quiet confidence of people who believed their truth was worth protecting. Harold could not be in that courtroom, but Eleanor made sure he was heard in it. That is not a legal strategy. That is a love story. And Marcus? He is not a monster, though it is tempting to file him away as one. He is something more ordinary and in some ways more troubling, a person who let comfort become entitlement, who mistook patience for passivity, and who learned too late that the quietest person in the room had been the most prepared one all along. He has not spoken publicly about the outcome. He has 37 months remaining on his court-ordered repayment schedule. Eleanor still lives on Birchwood Lane. She still makes pie for new neighbors. She still remembers everyone's birthday. And on her lapel, every single day, she wears Harold's brooch. Not as grief, as punctuation. If you have a parent, a grandparent, or someone you love who has spent a lifetime building something real, please share this story with them today. Not to frighten them, but because Eleanor's greatest weapon was not a courtroom maneuver or a clever legal clause. It was the years she and Harold spent building something together with enough care and honesty and foresight to survive even the worst kind of betrayal. Start that conversation while there is still time to have it calmly, around a kitchen table, the way Harold and Eleanor did before the fluorescent lights and the oak benches, and the silence of a courtroom ever become necessary? Because the best safes are the ones you never have to open. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the next story we are covering begins with a single voicemail that a woman almost deleted. And just like a leaner, it starts with someone everyone assumed would simply go away quietly. They had no idea